1514. Nuremberg. The air in the workshop is thick and cold, heavy with the metallic tang of copper plates and the acidic bite of ink. Outside, the sounds of the bustling city, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, are muffled, failing to penetrate the oppressive, almost sacred silence within. Here, by the weak, flickering light of a tallow candle that casts long, dancing shadows on the walls, a man is locked in a battle not of steel, but of spirit. This is Albrecht Dürer, the undisputed titan of the Northern Renaissance, a man whose fame has already crossed the Alps, whose monogram is a seal of genius recognized from Seville to Prague. And he is utterly, profoundly paralyzed. Before him lies a polished copper plate, its surface a cold, unforgiving mirror, reflecting his own strained face, a face framed by the famous Christ-like curls. His tool, the burin, feels impossibly heavy in his hand, an extension of a will that has faltered. All around him are the instruments of his power, the very tools he used to conquer the world of images. Compasses, rulers, a lathe, a crucible, a perfectly turned sphere, and a mysterious razor-edged polyhedron. They lie scattered, inert, useless. He has used them to dissect reality, to map the architecture of the human form, to codify the laws of perspective and impose a rational, geometric order upon the chaotic canvas of the world. But now they offer no solace. They are mere objects, silent witnesses to the agonizing realization that the universe of grief, of doubt, of divine mystery, the universe of the soul, cannot be measured. This is the moment of conception for his most enigmatic masterpiece, Melencolia I, an act of creation born not from a flash of inspiration, but from the dark, suffocating abyss of intellectual despair. The winged figure of genius sits slumped, her head in her hand, surrounded by the triumphant debris of science, yet powerless. This is not just a self-portrait of an artist's block. It is the portrait of an entire age's existential crisis, a moment where the boundless optimism of the Renaissance crashes against the hard, immutable shores of human limitation. This is the narrative of him, the artist who measured the soul with a compass, and in this moment of supreme crisis, discovered its infinite, terrifying dimensions. To understand this man, this colossus, who stood with one foot in the fading twilight of the Gothic world and the other in the blazing dawn of the Renaissance, we must return to the central, animating paradox of his life. This was the saga of the son of a humble goldsmith who dared to believe he could uncover the divine blueprint of creation, that he could, through the cold, hard logic of geometry and the unwavering precision of his hand, map the very face of God. The core question that haunts his entire body of work, from the hyper-detailed landscapes to the stark, confrontational self-portraits, is this: how? How did a man so steeped in the profound, often morbid piety of the late Middle Ages come to believe that the path to spiritual truth lay through the rigorous application of scientific principles? How did he reconcile the world of ecstatic faith, of saints and demons, with the world of vanishing points, anatomical studies, and mathematical proportions? His life was a relentless, 56-year quest to answer this question, to build a bridge between two seemingly irreconcilable continents of human experience, the intuitive soul and the rational mind. He did not see them as opposites. In his unique, intensely focused vision, they were two sides of the same divine coin. For Dürer, geometry was not a human invention, but a divine language. Proportion was not an aesthetic choice, but a reflection of celestial harmony. To capture the world with perfect accuracy was not merely an act of artistic mimicry, it was an act of theological reverence, a way of thinking God's thoughts after him. This audacious belief, this grand synthesis, would make him a prophet of a new kind of art and a new kind of artist. But it would also lead him to the precipice of the abyss we see in his workshop, to the chilling realization that the more he measured, the more immeasurable the ultimate mystery became. To understand Dürer, we must first understand the world that spawned him, a world on the brink, a civilization trembling with the violent birth pangs of the modern age. This was the Holy Roman Empire at the turn of the 16th century, less a unified state and more a sprawling, chaotic tapestry, woven from the threads of ancient feuds and new ambitions. It was a patchwork quilt of over 300 semi-independent states, electorates, duchies, free imperial cities, like Dürer's own Nuremberg, all held together by the thin, fraying thread of allegiance to an emperor, often more a symbol than a sovereign. It was a German-speaking world defined by its fractures, a place of profound anxieties and explosive potential. To the southeast, the specter of the Ottoman Empire loomed, a relentless, expanding power whose shadow fell across Vienna, a geopolitical reality that shaped the psyche of Central Europe. The call for crusades still echoed in the halls of power, a constant reminder of a dangerous, encroaching other. To the south, across the formidable barrier of the Alps, the Italian Renaissance was in full, glorious bloom, a cultural supernova radiating new ideas about art, science, and humanity itself, ideas that trickled north like a slow, subversive flood, challenging the very foundations of the grim, pious, Gothic worldview. And within the heart of the empire itself, a deep spiritual discontent was festering. The Catholic Church, a monolithic power for 1,000 years, was perceived by many as decadent, corrupt, and spiritually bankrupt, its complex machinery of indulgences and relics a cynical betrayal of the simple faith of the Gospels. The air was thick with prophecy and apocalyptic dread, a widespread feeling that history was accelerating towards a final, violent judgment. It was into this volatile, supercharged atmosphere that Dürer was born, a world of lingering medieval superstition and burgeoning scientific inquiry, of deep-seated piety and rising humanist skepticism. He was a product of this tension, a man whose genius lay in his ability to absorb all these contradictions and forge them into a new, powerful vision of the world. The character of this man, this alchemist of art, was forged not in a university or a prince's court, but in the fiery, clangorous crucible of his father's workshop in Nuremberg. Albrecht Dürer the Elder was a master goldsmith, a Hungarian immigrant who had brought with him the meticulous, uncompromising standards of his craft. The world of the young Albrecht was a sensory symphony of process and precision. It was the acrid smell of molten gold and silver, the hiss of hot metal plunged into water, the rhythmic percussive music of the hammer striking the anvil, and above all, the intense, focused silence required for the most delicate work of the burin, the sharp steel tool used to incise intricate designs onto the unforgiving surface of metal. This was not the free-flowing world of the brush. It was a world of immense constraint, where a single slip of the hand could ruin weeks of painstaking labor. This upbringing instilled in Dürer not just a technical mastery, but a moral and philosophical worldview. He learned that beauty was inseparable from discipline, that truth resided in precision, and that the creation of a perfect line was a form of prayer. His father, as he would later write with deep reverence, lived an honorable Christian life, was a man of patience, gentle, and at peace with everyone. This paternal legacy gave Dürer his anchor, a profound respect for craft, a deep-seated piety, and a powerful work ethic. But Nuremberg itself was his wider classroom. It was no mere provincial town. It was a thriving metropolis, a hub of international trade, a center for printing and publishing, and a bastion of humanist thought. It was a city of merchants and artisans, where wealth and status were built not on ancient lineage, but on skill, innovation, and ambition. This environment taught Dürer to be not just an artist, but an entrepreneur, a thinker who understood his own value in a world of dynamic change. The fusion of his father's rigid workshop discipline and his city's vibrant intellectual freedom created the unique alloy of his genius, the soul of a Gothic mystic housed within the mind of a Renaissance engineer. The first step out of this meticulously ordered world and into the great game of European art was a journey that would shatter and remake Dürer's entire conception of his craft. Following the time-honored tradition for German artisans, he embarked on his Wanderjahre, a period of journeyman travels meant to broaden his skills. But Dürer's ambition already burned far brighter than that of a typical craftsman. His true pilgrimage was not to the workshops of other German masters, but south, across the dizzying, snow-capped peaks of the Alps, into the sun-drenched landscape of Italy. In the autumn of 1494, he crossed this great physical and psychological barrier, descending into a world that must have seemed like another planet. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. This was a land where artists were not mere artisans, but celebrated intellectuals, courted by princes and popes. Here, he encountered the revolutionary works of Andrea Mantegna, whose mastery of perspective and classical forms seemed to transform paintings from flat surfaces into breathtakingly real windows onto another world. He saw the works of Giovanni Bellini in Venice, marveling at their use of color and light to evoke atmosphere and emotion. What he discovered was a different theory of art altogether. Where Northern art was focused on intense detail, emotional expression, and intricate symbolism, the Italians were obsessed with structure, harmony, and the underlying mathematical principles of beauty. They were rediscovering the lost knowledge of antiquity, the writings of Vitruvius and Euclid, and applying it to create an art of perfect, rational proportion. For Dürer, a man already predisposed to a love of order and precision, this was a profound revelation. It was as if he had been speaking in prose all his life and had suddenly discovered the existence of grammar. He realized that the intuitive genius of the North, for all its power, lacked a theoretical foundation. It was this realization that ignited the central mission of his life, to master this Italian science, to synthesize it with the spiritual depth of his own German heritage, and in doing so, to create a new, complete art that would be both intellectually rigorous and emotionally profound. He returned to Nuremberg not just as a more skilled painter, but as a revolutionary with a cause. At the core of this revolutionary ambition was a deep, driving, and often tormented inner force, an inner demon, if you will, born from the fusion of two powerful, seemingly contradictory impulses. On one hand, Dürer was a man of profound and deeply conventional late medieval piety. His worldview was saturated with a consciousness of sin, a meditation on the fragility of life, and an ever-present awareness of death and the final judgment. The iconography of his work is filled with the memento mori, the reminder of mortality, from the skeletal figure of death on horseback to his almost obsessive depictions of Christ's passion. He prayed, he fasted, and he lived in a spiritual cosmos populated by God, the devil, saints, and demons, forces that were intensely real to him. This part of him was a product of the dark forests of the German soul, a legacy of centuries of Gothic faith that emphasized the suffering of the body and the salvation of the spirit. Yet, on the other hand, coexisting with this pious soul was the restless, insatiably curious mind of a scientist. He was possessed by a relentless desire to know, to understand, to deconstruct, and to measure the world around him. He was not content to simply paint a plant. He had to render its every leaf and root with botanical accuracy, as in his famous watercolor, The Great Piece of Turf. He was not content to draw a hare. He had to capture the texture of its fur, the glint in its eye, the very essence of its hairness. This empirical drive pushed him to conduct anatomical studies, to explore the mathematical theories of perspective, and to embark on a lifelong, obsessive quest to discover the canon of human proportion, the perfect mathematical formula for the ideal human body. For Dürer, this was not an act of blasphemy, but its opposite. He believed that the visible, material world was God's first book of revelation. To study it with scientific rigor was to decipher the mind of the Creator. He sought divine order in a world that, to his pious medieval mind, seemed fundamentally chaotic and fallen. His art became the laboratory for this grand experiment, an attempt to prove, through the perfection of geometry and the precision of observation, that behind the veil of a corrupt and transient world lay a blueprint of divine, mathematical, and eternal harmony. No man can build a new world alone. Dürer's ambition to elevate art from a trade to a liberal art, to transform the artist from a craftsman into a philosopher, required an intellectual toolkit he did not initially possess. He found it in his fateful friendship with Willibald Pirkheimer. Pirkheimer was everything Dürer was not by birth: a wealthy patrician, a towering figure in Nuremberg's ruling council, a classical scholar fluent in Latin and Greek, and a humanist in the purest Italian mold. He had studied at the great universities of Padua and Pavia, and his mind was a repository of the classical knowledge that was fueling the Renaissance. Their friendship became one of the great intellectual partnerships of the age. It was Pirkheimer who opened the doors of the classical world to Dürer. He translated the works of Greek and Roman authors, introducing the artist to the philosophical currents of Neoplatonism, which held that the physical world was but a shadow of a higher, ideal reality. This idea resonated powerfully with Dürer's own quest to find the perfect, ideal forms hidden within nature. Through their long conversations, Pirkheimer provided Dürer with the intellectual framework and the philosophical vocabulary to articulate what he had instinctively felt. He helped Dürer see his own work not just as the creation of beautiful images, but as a profound philosophical inquiry into the nature of beauty, truth, and the divine. Pirkheimer also served as Dürer's patron, his advocate, and his social connector, introducing him to a circle of Nuremberg's most brilliant minds. This alliance was a two-way street. If Pirkheimer gave Dürer intellectual legitimacy, Dürer gave Pirkheimer's humanist circle a visual genius capable of translating their abstract ideas into powerful, enduring images. Together, they formed the nucleus of the Northern Renaissance in Germany. This fateful encounter was the catalyst that allowed Dürer to complete his transformation. He had the hand of a goldsmith and the soul of a German mystic. Pirkheimer gave him the mind of a Renaissance philosopher. Armed with this new intellectual arsenal, Dürer was ready to launch his revolution and permanently change the course of European art. Upon his return from his first transformative journey to Italy, Dürer faced the entrenched and conservative reality of the Nuremberg guilds. To these established masters, he was an upstart. His newfangled Italian ideas about proportion and perspective, a threat to their time-honored traditions. They controlled the commissions, the workshops, the very right to practice as a master. In this rigid system, the path to power was slow and deferential. But Dürer was armed with more than just new ideas. He possessed a keen entrepreneurial instinct and a revolutionary technology. Instead of fighting a protracted war within the guild system for painted altarpieces, He turned his focus to the medium of printmaking, woodcuts and engravings. This was a strategic masterstroke. Prints were cheaper to produce, easily replicable, and could be disseminated across the continent. This technology allowed him to bypass the local gatekeepers of art and appeal directly to a vast, international market. He established his own workshop, acting not just as an artist, but as a publisher and a businessman. His series of woodcuts, like the monumental Apocalypse of 1498, were a sensation. They were technically brilliant, emotionally powerful, and commercially successful. But his most revolutionary act was the creation of his monogram, the elegant, unmistakable intertwining of the letters ED and D. He placed this mark prominently on every print, transforming it from a simple signature into a guarantee of quality, a symbol of origin, and a mark of genius. In an age of anonymous craftsmanship, Dürer was creating a brand. He aggressively protected it, even suing a foreign artist for plagiarism in a landmark case. This was the price of power in the New Age, the fusion of artistic genius with commercial acumen. He was not just selling images, he was selling himself, his identity, the idea of a Dürer. In doing so, he shattered the medieval conception of the artist as a humble artisan and forged a new one. The artist as a sovereign creator, an intellectual property owner, a prince in the republic of letters and lines. The great antagonist in Dürer's life was not a person, not a rival artist, or a scheming prince. It was something far larger and more amorphous, the very soul of the culture from which he sprang. His primary adversary was the untamed, chaotic, and profoundly intuitive spirit of the northern Gothic world. This was the world of the Märchen, of dark, impenetrable forests where witches and monsters lurked, a world shaped by 1,000 years of folklore, superstition, and a form of Christianity that was often ecstatic, mystical, and deeply suspicious of worldly reason. The Gothic aesthetic, which still dominated Northern Europe, reflected this worldview. It was an art of extreme emotional intensity, of twisted, suffering Christs, of grotesque demons, of saints lost in rapturous visions. It valued expressive power above all else, often at the expense of naturalistic accuracy. The bodies were elongated, the compositions crowded, the details minute and symbolic, but the underlying structure could be arbitrary, governed by spiritual hierarchies rather than the laws of physics. Dürer, while a product of this tradition and a master of its emotional language, saw it as a magnificent, beautiful, but ultimately untamed wilderness. His journey to Italy had shown him a different path, the clear, sunlit, rational world of classical order. He came to see the Gothic spirit as something that needed to be disciplined, educated, and given a solid, rational foundation. His life's work became a great civilizing mission, an attempt to impose the logic, clarity, and harmony of Italian classicism upon the raw, passionate energy of the German soul. He sought to teach it the language of proportion, to guide it with the laws of perspective, to give its powerful emotions a stable, coherent structure. This conflict is visible in all his work, the tension between the meticulous, almost obsessive detail of the Northern tradition and the balanced, harmonious compositions of the South. He was a conqueror, an artistic Caesar, attempting to subdue the wild tribes of the Gothic imagination with the legions of Renaissance reason. This was his great war, a struggle fought not on the battlefield, but on the surfaces of wood blocks, copper plates, and linden wood panels. Even for a titan who sought to impose order on the universe sometimes strikes back with a brutal, irrational force that shatters all systems. For Dürer, that moment arrived in the year 1514. It was a year of profound crisis, culminating in a psychological breaking point triggered by the death of his mother, Barbara. Dürer had always been close to his mother, a pious woman who had borne 18 children and lived a life of hardship. As she lay dying, emaciated and ravaged by illness, he sat by her bedside and did what he had always done. He observed and he drew. The result is one of the most unflinching and devastating portraits in the history of art. Executed in silver point, a medium that allows for no error, the drawing captures the stark reality of impending death with chilling objectivity. He records the hollowed-out eyes, the sunken cheeks, the flesh stretched taut over the skull, the mouth agape in a final, silent struggle for breath. There is no sentimentality here, no attempt to beautify or idealize. There is only the cold, hard, empirical truth of decay. He wrote of her death. She feared death much, but she said that to come before God, she did not fear. In this moment, Dürer the scientist-artist confronted the absolute limit of his powers. He could measure the proportions of a living body, but he could not measure the dimensions of grief. He could capture the precise topography of a dying face, but he could not penetrate the mystery of the departing soul. This raw, personal encounter with mortality, the ultimate chaotic event, exposed the inadequacy of his rational tools. It was this profound sense of intellectual and spiritual crisis that flowed directly into the creation of Melencolia I later that year. The great winged genius, paralyzed amidst her instruments of science, is Dürer himself, the master of measurement, who has come face to face with the unmeasurable. He understood in that dark year that true wisdom lay not in finding all the answers, but in recognizing the vastness of what would forever remain unknown. Into this world of personal grief and intellectual doubt, a new force erupted, a theological earthquake that would provide Dürer with a new sense of purpose, a new cause to which he could dedicate his immense talents. On October 31st, 1517, a hitherto obscure Augustinian monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, and the world changed forever. The Reformation had begun. For Dürer, who had long been troubled by the corruption and commercialism of the church, Luther's message was a blast of purifying fire. He saw in Luther a kindred spirit, a fellow German on a quest for a more authentic, direct, and unmediated truth. He wrote in his journal with breathless excitement, "If God helps me to see Dr. Martin Luther, I will carefully draw his portrait and engrave it on copper for a long-lasting remembrance of this Christian man who has helped me out of great anxieties." For Dürer, the Reformation was not a political rebellion, but a spiritual liberation. It promised a return to the pure source of faith, the Word of God in the Scriptures, sweeping away the unnecessary and corrupt intermediaries of the papal hierarchy. He saw an opportunity in this chaos, a chance to align his art with the greatest historical movement of his time. He immediately channeled his energies into his printmaking workshop, which was perfectly positioned to serve the cause. While Luther's words were translated into German and spread by the printing press, Dürer's images gave the Reformation its visual language. His woodcuts of Christ, the apostles, and saints were now imbued with a new, Protestant sensibility. They were no longer icons for a Catholic cult of veneration, but illustrations for personal, scriptural devotion. He became, in effect, the chief visual propagandist of the early Reformation, using his internationally recognized brand to lend legitimacy and powerful emotional appeal to Luther's ideas. In the great, chaotic struggle for the soul of Christendom, Dürer had found a new, grand subject worthy of his genius. The absolute apex of Dürer's artistic and intellectual journey, the moment where all the conflicting currents of his life converged into a statement of breathtaking power and complexity, came between 1513 and 1514 with the creation of his 3 Meisterstücke, or master engravings. These 3 medium-sized prints, Night, Death, and the Devil, St. Jerome in his study, and Melencolia I, were not conceived as a formal series, but they form a profound spiritual and psychological triptych, representing 3 different paths of life, 3 different modes of being in a troubled world. Night, Death, and the Devil is a vision of the active life, the vita activa. A Christian knight, clad in shining armor, rides with unwavering resolve through a dark, menacing gorge, accompanied by his faithful dog. He is assailed by the grotesque figures of death on a pale horse and a pig-snouted devil. Yet he ignores them, his gaze fixed on the distant, shining fortress of God. It is a powerful allegory of moral fortitude, of the Christian soldier marching steadfastly toward salvation through a world of temptation and decay. St. Jerome in his study, by contrast, represents the contemplative life, the vita contemplativa. Here, all is peace, order, and tranquility. The saint sits at his desk in a sun-drenched, orderly room, absorbed in his scholarly work of translating the Bible. The light pouring through the leaded glass windows creates a palpable sense of divine presence and intellectual serenity. This is the ideal of the humanist scholar, finding God not on the battlefield of life, but in the quiet, rational pursuit of knowledge and faith. And finally, Melancholia. I represents the intellectual life, the vita intellectualis, but shown in a state of crisis. It is the dark night of the soul for the thinker, the artist, the scientist, who, having exhausted the limits of human reason, finds not serenity, but a profound, paralyzing despair. Taken together, these 3 engravings represent the culmination of Dürer's genius. They showcase his absolute mastery of the engraving technique, his ability to create astonishing effects of light, texture, and detail. But more than that, they are a deep philosophical meditation on the human condition, a testament to a man grappling with the greatest questions of life, faith, and the limits of human understanding. To gaze upon Albrecht Dürer's self-portraits is to witness the steady, deliberate construction of a new identity for the artist in society. It is a visual record of his dawning self-awareness, his rising ambition, and his ultimate claim to a status far beyond that of a mere craftsman. In his earliest self-portrait from his teenage years, we see a gifted, but still uncertain youth. By 1498, after his return from Italy, the transformation is stunning. He presents himself as a dashing, elegantly dressed gentleman, a man of the world, his gloved hands a sign of his refusal to be seen as a manual laborer. His gaze is confident, his bearing aristocratic. He's no longer simply Albrecht the painter. He is Albrecht Dürer, the humanist, the man of intellect and standing. But it is the self-portrait of 1500 that represents the true moment of hubris, a breathtakingly audacious statement of artistic and spiritual ambition. Here, at the age of 28, he presents himself in a rigidly frontal pose, a format traditionally reserved for icons of Christ Pantocrator. His long, centrally parted hair and neatly trimmed beard deliberately evoke this sacred imagery. His hand is raised to his fur collar in a gesture that is both a display of his wealth and a subtle echo of a gesture of blessing. The background is a stark, empty darkness, removing him from any earthly context and placing him in a timeless, eternal space. The inscription, written in Latin, reads, "I, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, portrayed myself in everlasting colors, aged 28 years." This is not just a painting, it is a proclamation. Dürer is making the radical claim that the artist's creative act is a mirror of God's creation. He is arguing that human creativity is a divine spark, and that the genius artist is a vessel for a higher power. This was an idea that had been circulating in Italian Neoplatonic circles, but no artist before Dürer had dared to state it with such shocking visual directness. He saw his triumph not just as personal success, but as a fulfillment of a divine mission to bring German art to a new level of perfection and intellectual dignity. He was Apelles, the legendary painter of antiquity, reborn in the North, a creator in his own right. While Dürer's grand antagonist was the abstract spirit of the Gothic age, his ambition was also fueled by a more personal, earthly rivalry. Embodied by the artists of the Italian Renaissance, he deeply admired their achievements, but he also felt a palpable sense of what we might today call cultural anxiety, a northern artist's insecurity when faced with the overwhelming prestige of the South. This complex relationship is perfectly encapsulated in his interactions with the Venetian artist Jacopo de Barbari. De Barbari was an older, more established painter and printmaker who had worked in Venice and later moved to Germany, eventually serving in the same court as Dürer. He was a keeper of secrets, a possessor of the coveted Italian knowledge of human proportion. Dürer was fascinated and frustrated by him. He recounts in his own writings how de Barbari showed him drawings of a male and female figure constructed according to a mathematical canon, but would not show his principles clearly, guarding the knowledge as a trade secret. This encounter both infuriated and galvanized Dürer. It confirmed his suspicion that the Italians possessed a systematic, scientific basis for their art, a knowledge that the German artists, for all their skill, lacked. It became a personal obsession for him to uncover these principles for himself, not just to imitate the Italians, but to master their science and then surpass them. His quest for the canon of proportion was, in part, an attempt to break this Italian intellectual monopoly. He sought to discover, and then, crucially, to publish these secrets, to make them available to all his fellow German artists. He saw this as an act of patriotic generosity, a way of lifting his entire national school of art. This sworn enemy, the shadowy, secretive figure of the Italian master, was a powerful motivator. It drove Dürer's relentless theoretical studies and fueled his ambition to prove that the German mind was capable of just as much intellectual rigor and rational clarity as the Italian, and that when this was combined with the German spirit's unique depth and sincerity, the result would be an art of unparalleled power. Dürer's ambition extended far beyond the creation of individual masterpieces. He was driven by a powerful didactic impulse, a desire not just to be a great artist, but to be a great teacher, a lawgiver for German art. He feared that the hard-won knowledge he had acquired over a lifetime of struggle would die with him. He was determined to codify his discoveries, to create a permanent, rational system that would elevate his craft from a practice based on intuition and apprenticeship to a science based on objective principles. This ambition culminated in his great theoretical treatises, the work of his later years. In 1525, he published his Unterweisung der Messung mit dem Zirkel und Richtscheit, the art of measurement with compass and ruler, a practical manual for artists on the principles of geometry. It was the first book of its kind for adults in German, a groundbreaking work that explained complex concepts like linear perspective, the construction of polygons, and the creation of the Platonic solids. It was a book designed to give artists the mathematical tools they needed to represent the world with rational accuracy. His magnum opus of theory, however, was the Vier Bücher von menschlicher Proportion, 4 books on human proportion, the first volume of which was published in the year of his death, 1528, with the rest published posthumously by his wife and Pirkheimer. This was the culmination of his lifelong, obsessive quest. In these volumes, he meticulously detailed a system for constructing the human figure, male and female, of various types and ages, using a complex system of measurement and geometry. He was not trying to present a single ideal canon, but rather to demonstrate the diversity of human types, all governed by an underlying mathematical harmony. These books were his great reform, his intellectual legacy. They were an attempt to build a permanent scaffolding for all future generations of Northern artists, to give them the theoretical foundation that he had been forced to seek out for himself in a foreign land. It was the ultimate expression of his belief that art must be built on the bedrock of science. Behind the monumental figure of the philosopher-artist, behind the creator of Christ-like self-portraits and complex allegories, stood a man grounded in the mundane, often difficult realities of everyday life. This is the onion and vegetable layer of his story, the domestic and financial context that shaped his decisions and colored his existence. At the center of this world was his wife, Agnes Fry. Their marriage, arranged by their families in 1494, appears to have been a pragmatic and often contentious union, devoid of the romantic passion Dürer poured into his art. Pirkheimer, in a famously biased and probably unfair letter, portrayed Agnes as a greedy, shrewish woman who drove her husband to work himself to death for financial gain. While this is likely an exaggeration, Dürer's own letters and records suggest a relationship that was more of a business partnership than a meeting of souls. Agnes was a shrewd manager of the workshop's finances, a capable saleswoman for his prints, but she seems to have had little understanding of or sympathy for his grand intellectual ambitions. His world was also one of meticulous, almost obsessive record-keeping. His journals and letters provide an astonishingly detailed account of his travels, his expenses, his sales, and his health. We can read about the price he paid for pigments, the cost of lodging on his journey to Venice, his complaints about the declining value of currency. This financial pragmatism was an essential part of his success, the engine that funded his artistic experiments. We also see a man plagued by hypochondria, constantly worried about his health. In a famous drawing sent to his doctor, he points to a spot on his abdomen, writing, "Where the yellow spot is, to which I point with my finger, there it hurts." This close attention to the frailties of his own body stands in poignant contrast to his quest for the ideal, perfect human form. These details, the difficult marriage, the careful accounting, the constant worry about his spleen, do not diminish his genius. Instead, they humanize him, reminding us that the man who sought to map the mind of God was also a man who had to manage a household, balance a ledger, and grapple with the everyday anxieties of life, work, and marriage in 16th century Nuremberg. The grand synthesis Dürer had constructed, his belief that the rational reforms of humanism and the spiritual purification of the Reformation would lead to a more godly and ordered world, began to show its first deep cracks in the mid-1520s. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon finally broke in 1524 with the eruption of the German Peasants' War. This was a massive, bloody uprising of the peasant classes, who, inspired in part by a radical interpretation of Luther's call for Christian freedom, rose up against their feudal lords, demanding an end to oppression and a new social order based on the gospel. For Dürer, this was a moment of profound horror and disillusionment. The very movement he had championed as a force for spiritual cleansing had unleashed a wave of social chaos and fratricidal violence that threatened to tear the fabric of society apart. He was a man of the city, a believer in civic order and hierarchical stability. The anarchic fury of the peasants terrified him. He saw the ideals of the Reformation being twisted into a justification for murder, plunder, and the complete breakdown of the authority he believed was divinely ordained. His response was unequivocal. In his exhortation to peace, he condemned the rebellious peasants, siding firmly with the ruling princes who would go on to crush the revolt with merciless brutality, slaughtering an estimated 100,000 people. This event was a deep psychological blow. It was a stark demonstration that human nature, which he had tried to codify and idealize in his art, was also capable of a savagery that defied all rational systems. The world was not moving towards a more ordered, enlightened state. It seemed to be descending into a new, more violent form of darkness. This was a harbinger of the storm to come, the religious wars that would tear Germany apart for the next century. For Dürer, the man who craved harmony and order above all else, it was the beginning of a great unraveling. In the summer of 1520, a physically and spiritually weary Dürer embarked on a long and arduous journey to the Netherlands. On the surface, the purpose of this fateful act was purely practical. His great patron, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, had died, and the lifetime pension Maximilian had granted him was now in jeopardy. Dürer needed to have it confirmed by the new young emperor, Charles the Maître, who was holding court in the Low Countries. This was the official reason, the pragmatic concern of a man who carefully managed his finances. But beneath this lay a deeper, more restless motivation. The journey was also a final, great pilgrimage in search of knowledge and wonder. He was still the insatiably curious man who had crossed the Alps a quarter-century earlier. His detailed diary from this trip is a testament to his unending thirst for new experiences. He met with fellow artists like Quentin Massey's and Lucas van Leyden. He studied the works of the Van Eyck brothers. He sketched exotic animals he saw in a menagerie. But one entry reveals the obsessive, almost reckless nature of his curiosity. Having heard reports that a gigantic whale had been beached on the coast of Zeeland in the southwest of the Netherlands, he made a special, difficult side trip in the dead of winter to see this marvel of God's creation. He was a man in his late 40s, not in robust health, traveling into a notoriously damp and unhealthy region. He made this decision not out of necessity, but out of an overwhelming desire to see, to document, to understand. He wanted to witness this monster from the deep, another piece of the divine puzzle he was trying to assemble. He was, in a sense, chasing a myth, a symbol of nature's awesome, untamable power. This decision, driven by the very intellectual curiosity that had defined his entire life, would prove to be his undoing. It was an act of intellectual hubris that would have catastrophic physical consequences. The journey to the Zeeland coast was a disaster. By the time Dürer and his small party arrived, the great whale, which had been stranded by a storm tide, had been washed back out to sea by another. The prize he sought had vanished, but the swampy, miasmic landscape of the Dutch coast had a parting gift for him. In this damp, fever-ridden environment, Dürer contracted an illness that would plague him for the rest of his life. His diary entries and later letters describe recurring bouts of fever, chills, and a painful ailment of the spleen, symptoms consistent with a chronic form of malaria. This was the greatest, most tragic irony of his life. The man who had dedicated his existence to the pursuit of order, harmony, and rational control was laid low by the most chaotic and microscopic of forces, a parasite, an unseen enemy from the untamed world of nature. The hand that had drawn with such unwavering precision now trembled with fever. The mind that had wrestled with the highest concepts of philosophy was now clouded by debilitating sickness. Nature, the very subject of his meticulous, lifelong study, had struck back, infecting his body and curtailing his strength. He returned to Nuremberg in 1521, his pension secured from the emperor, but his health permanently broken. The great quest to measure the world had ended with his own body being invaded by an unmeasurable, invisible force. This physical catastrophe marked the beginning of the final phase of his life, a period of declining physical energy, but of intense, focused spiritual and artistic activity, as the shadow of his own mortality grew ever longer. The final years of Albrecht Dürer's life were a slow, painful collapse of the body, but a powerful, defiant consolidation of the spirit. He returned to Nuremberg a semi-invalid, his productive capacity diminished by the recurrent bouts of the Zealand fever. He undertook fewer large commissions and traveled no more. His world shrank to his house, his workshop, and his circle of close friends. Yet, this physical decline seemed to trigger a final, powerful surge of artistic and spiritual energy. Stripped of his former vigor, he turned inward, focusing his remaining strength on a final, monumental artistic statement. He largely abandoned the commercial printmaking that had made him rich and famous, and dedicated himself to what he considered his true legacy. He continued his work on his theoretical treatises, desperate to finish his books on measurement and proportion before his time ran out. But his ultimate testament was a work of painting, the medium he had always considered the highest form of art. Between 1523 and 1526, he worked on 2 large panels depicting 4 of the apostles: John, Peter, Mark, and Paul. These are not the saints of Catholic iconography, surrounded by gold leaf and narrative incident. They are colossal, solemn, statuesque figures, presented with a stark, Protestant gravity. They are embodiments of theological principles. Dürer presented these panels as a gift to the City Council of Nuremberg in 1526, accompanied by inscriptions warning against the dangers of false prophets and religious extremism. This was his final verdict on the chaos of his times. Having witnessed the bloody excesses of the Peasants' War and the growing fanaticism of radical Protestant sects, the man who had once enthusiastically embraced the Reformation now offered a solemn plea for moderation, humanism, and a faith grounded in the Scripture, not in the wild pronouncements of self-appointed prophets. The 4 Apostles was his last will and testament, a retreat from the turbulent world into a final, powerful statement of his deepest moral and spiritual convictions. The end came on the 6th of April, 1528. Albrecht Dürer died in his home on the corner of the Zisselgasse in Nuremberg at the age of 56. The malarial fever he had contracted in the swamps of Zealand 8 years earlier had finally claimed him. His lifelong friend, Willibald Pirkheimer, was overcome with grief, writing a moving eulogy that captured the magnitude of the loss. "In truth," he wrote, "I have lost in him the best friend I have had in my life, and I mourn for this man who was the most excellent of men, but for whom it was God's will to be called from this world." Pirkheimer's words set the tone for the legacy that was to come. Nuremberg, and indeed all of Germany, mourned not just a great artist, but a great man, a national treasure, a figure who had, through the sheer force of his genius and ambition, lifted German art onto the world stage. His death was the passing of an era. He died at his drawing board, a man of discipline and order to the very last. His finale was not one of violent, tragic drama, but of a slow, determined fading, a quiet battle against a failing body. The circumstances of his death brought his life's narrative full circle. The man who was obsessed with the perfection of the human form spent his last years documenting its decay. The great traveler ended his life confined to his hometown. The artist whose curiosity had known no bounds was ultimately killed by that very curiosity. Yet, in his final works, he achieved a kind of peace, a resolution of the great conflicts that had driven him. He had sought to find a stable, rational foundation for faith, and in the end, in the face of chaos and his own mortality, it was his faith that provided the final, stable foundation for his art. His hero's finale was not a loud crescendo, but a quiet, solemn, and profoundly moving final chord. The legacy of Albrecht Dürer is not a single, stable monument, but a vast, contested territory, a battleground where subsequent generations have fought to claim his spirit as their own. Immediately after his death, he was canonized as the father of the German Renaissance, the ultimate patriot artist. For the German romantics of the 19th century, he was rediscovered as a quintessential national genius, a figure who embodied the depth, sincerity, and spiritual intensity of the German soul. They saw in his work a proto-romantic sensibility, a connection to the wild, mystical spirit of the German forests, conveniently ignoring the classicizing, rationalist obsession that drove much of his work. This interpretation reached its most perverse and sinister conclusion in the 20th century, when the Nazi regime co-opted Dürer as a supreme icon of the Aryan race. His night, death, and the devil was reinterpreted as a symbol of the stoic, heroic German soldier, and his Christ-like self-portrait was held up as proof of a Nordic, non-Jewish Jesus. His art was twisted into propaganda for a murderous ideology, a dark stain on his legacy that he could never have imagined. In the post-war world, art historians have worked to reclaim him from this distortion, presenting a more complex and accurate picture. He is now seen as the quintessential Renaissance man of the North, a colossus who bridged the medieval and modern worlds, a universal genius whose influence was felt across Europe. He is studied as a master printmaker, a revolutionary entrepreneur, a profound theorist, and a deeply sensitive observer of the natural world. This conflict of interpretations reveals a crucial truth. Dürer is so immense, so multifaceted, that every era can find a reflection of its own values and anxieties in his work. He is at once a pious Christian and a scientific rationalist, a proud German and a cosmopolitan European, a man of the people and a prince of art. His legacy remains as complex and contradictory as the man himself. So we return, at the end of our saga, to the central dramatic paradox, the core question that animated the life of this northern titan. How did a man who saw God in geometry and sought to measure the soul with a compass reconcile these two worlds? Why did he believe he could chart the infinite with finite tools? The final comprehensive answer is that for Albrecht Dürer, there was no paradox. He did not see faith and reason as two warring armies, but as a single, integrated system of knowing. In his worldview, which was deeply influenced by the Neoplatonism he absorbed from his humanist friends, the material world was not a prison for the soul, but a divinely written text. And the language of this text, the syntax of God's creation, was mathematics. Geometry was not a human abstraction. It was the invisible scaffolding of reality. The proportions of a perfectly formed human body were not an accident of biology. They were a distant echo of the divine harmony of the cosmos. Therefore, the artist's task was not simply to copy the flawed, imperfect surfaces of the world, but to use the tools of reason, the compass, the ruler, the laws of perspective, to penetrate through to the perfect, underlying geometric truth. To measure a human hand with precision was, for Dürer, an act of theological discovery. It was an attempt to reverse engineer the Creator's design, to glimpse the mind of God. His quest did not break him. Rather, his genius lay in his ability to hold these two poles in a state of creative tension his entire life. The crisis that produced Melancholia was not a rejection of this quest. It was the devastatingly honest admission that the quest was infinite. He had pushed reason to its absolute limit, only to find that it opened onto an even vaster mystery. He did not seek to replace God with science. He sought to find God's signature written in the language of science, and his life's work is the majestic, beautiful, and ultimately unfinished record of that search. What, then, is the universal lesson of his life, the verdict of history on this man who stood at the great crossroads of civilization? The story of Albrecht Dürer is the eternal saga of the human mind's desperate, noble, and unending struggle to impose order upon a chaotic universe. He was the ultimate bridge builder, a man whose entire life was an attempt to span the chasm between opposing worlds. He built a bridge between the medieval and the modern, carrying the spiritual intensity of the Gothic Age into the new, sunlit landscape of the Renaissance. He built a bridge between the North and the South, undertaking a great intellectual transfer of knowledge from Italy to Germany, determined to give his homeland the tools of a new artistic science. He built a bridge between art and commerce, transforming the artist from a humble guild member into a self-aware, international entrepreneur. Most profoundly, he sought to build a bridge across the deepest schism in the human experience, the divide between the intuitive, believing soul and the curious, measuring mind. His life is a testament to the idea that these forces do not have to be at war, that they can, in a mind vast enough to contain them, enrich and inform one another. The final verdict is not one of success or failure. In the end, he did not discover a single, perfect canon of beauty, nor could his rational systems prevent his world from descending into religious fanaticism and war. But his legacy lies not in the finality of his answers, but in the profound courage and integrity of his questions. His life teaches us that the highest calling of the human intellect is not to conquer mystery, but to engage with it, to measure what can be measured, and to stand in honest, reverent awe before that which cannot. And so, we are left with a final, enduring image. It is not the face of a suffering Christ or the grim visage of death, but a simple, elegant tool that contains the entire universe of his ambition, a compass. See it in your mind's eye. One leg is planted, fixed, and unmoving, a single, sharp point pressed into the paper. This is the anchor point of faith, the unwavering belief in a divine, ordered center to all things. The other leg swings outward, free to move, its sharp point scribing a perfect, clean, rational arc across the page. This is the restless, sweeping arm of human reason, of scientific inquiry, of the desire to explore, to measure, and to map the world. The two legs are inseparable. Without the fixed point, the sweeping arc is meaningless, unmoored. Without the sweeping arc, the fixed point is sterile, isolated, a truth that reaches for nothing. This is the final frame of our story, the delicious philosophical aftertaste of the kebab. The compass, an instrument of cold, hard science, becomes in his hands a symbol of divine perfection, a tool that forever attempts to draw a finite circle capable of containing the infinite. This simple, beautiful, and eternally impossible act was the life and the enduring magic of Albrecht Dürer. 156.2